Okay, in this tutorial, I'm going to take you through some really basic aspects of creating and setting up cameras for the first time in Maya. So our scene is this. It's just an artist's easel with a light and a fruit bowl in the foreground, and that's pretty much it. Pretty simple, pretty standard. And what this is going to allow us to see, in part, is the difference in the perceived distance between the foreground and background objects depending on our focal lengths, for instance, as well as just setting up a basic camera to understand how its attributes function similar to a real-world camera's attributes. So whenever we start working in Maya, our very first camera that we get is the perspective camera, which is the camera that we're going to use to orbit around the scene and to be able to see where everything's at, but it's not going to be the camera that we actually use to set up our renders or to work from a production standpoint. It's just going to be kind of a go-between camera. So it's really important that we manage to set up our cameras properly. And we, of course, can create more than one camera in Maya. We don't have to be just stuck with the defaults. So to do that, what we're going to do is come to the Create menu. And in here, one of the options is Cameras. Now, there are several options when we come to cameras. There's just a basic camera, camera and camera aim and up. We're going to go with just basic camera for now. The other ones are, they're basically the same kind of thing, but they have a few more extra options, and they allow for a specific object to be pointed at by the camera, which is the aim, and the camera aim and up allows for the camera to be tilted a bit while it's aiming at an object. So, those are things that could be of use maybe later on down the pipe, but for now we're just going to keep it basic. We're definitely not doing stereoscopy yet or a multi-stereo rig, so much more advanced. So basic camera for now. Okay, and what that does is it creates this little camera icon right at the center of the scene. I just pressed F there to focus up on it, which is a nice convenient little shortcut that I use all the time. Whenever you have selected, you can just press F. Now, this camera here is not really a real object. It's just a representation in space. So it just tells me where the camera is. It could look like anything, but they chose to make something that looks sort of like a camera. All right, so in order to see through this camera, there's a couple ways we could look at it. First off, we could just select it, and we get our camera shape node and our basic camera node. If we're looking for it in the scene, it's not always easy to find. We could come to our outliner, so Windows Outliner, and we could find it in here. Just currently it's set to camera 1. Another way we can find it is if we come into the panels of our viewport and look at our perspective cameras. There's the default perspective cam that we had originally, and here's camera 1. So if I click on this, I end up actually looking through the scene through camera 1, the new camera that I created, which is kind of cool. And this allows me to actually use it as a regular perspective kind of camera. So I use the same controls that I have always used to move around Maya. First thing I want to do is to actually rename this camera. So I'm going to just call this in capital letters. This is how I generally work, shot cam. Now, that works if I have only a single camera for the scene. If I have multiple cameras, then I might want to name them each something that's meaningful, that tells me a little bit about what the shot is that that camera is framing. That way, down the line, I don't forget what cameras are, because you can easily have a bunch of cameras in your scene and then have a big list here and not know what's what. So it's really, really important to keep organized. It makes your life so much easier in the end. Right, so we are currently looking through ShotCam. You see that that's updated here as well. Okay, so this camera basically is identical to the perspective camera in terms of all of its attributes. So it's probably best to just go through and take a look at a few of these attributes to get an idea of what they do. So what I'm going to do is line up my scene here so that we can better see what's going on. And there's a few options up here at the top of the viewport in terms of showing us what's going on in the scene. There's, of course, the grid, which is sort of a representation of the floor at the moment. Not necessary to have on, but you could keep it on for now. There's the film gate and the resolution gate. really between these two, the only one that I ever really use is the resolution gate, because what this does is it shows me, of course, what the actual bounds are based on my render settings, which is this little button right here. If I click on that, and I wanted to change my render settings, say for instance, like the project's render settings, which is set to 720p, which HD 720 is the same thing here, right? Now the framing that I get here is a little bit different. Okay, so if we just put it into that for the moment for the sake of example, that'll work for us. Okay, and of course this just is a preview of what it's going to look like when it renders out. Everything outside of this bounds is of course not going to be rendered. There are a few other things that you could look at as well, depending on how you are framing up your shots. There is what's called the safe action area, which is this little button that I clicked on here. And what this means is that any action that's occurring, any kind of movement, motion, anything like that, should be within this bounds. Right? Anything outside of that might end up getting lost or misjudged, for instance. Similar, safe title, which is even smaller in terms of a bounds. If you are creating titles that overlay your scene here in any way, in order to make sure that they read well and that they don't get clipped or look weird like they're smushed against the edge, make sure that they fit within these bounds. Now these are the same things that you would find in other editing software like Premiere or After Effects. So most likely you're not doing your titles in Maya, but if you're doing like 3D titles for instance, then this could be a good way to make sure that you have some protection enabled. Okay, so the very first thing that we're going to do is look at, in our camera shape, the angle of view versus the focal length. Now these two are intricately tied together. They are sort of inversions of each other, which means you only need to change one and the other one will update. Depending on the information that you have, you might have information about what is the angle of view in your scene or the focal length of your camera. Most of the time it's just going to be the focal length of the camera. So what we have right now corresponds to what is effectively a 35mm focal length. And what that means is if you look at a camera and you kind of imagine, I don't really have a picture of it here, but I just quickly went and grabbed one here. If we imagine this as our camera, right, and here's your lens at the front, then the distance from the lens to where the imaging device is on your camera, which is the little sensor that converts visual light information into a digital signal, that distance is called the focal length, right? And the shorter that focal length, then of course the closer the lens is to the sensor. And the longer the focal length, the farther away it is. A shorter focal length results in a more widescreen look and a greater sense of depth within your scene, and I should say a greater sense of perspective within your scene. And a longer focal length ends up in what's called a telephoto style, which tends to crush depth in your scene. So I'm just going to get rid of that for the moment. Okay, so 35mm, that's the typical starting point in Maya, but it's not a great focal length because there's not a whole hell of a lot that works with 35mm perfectly. I like to work with, so if I'm trying to recreate something as a human would see it, right, then that would be closer to 50mm. If I want to go to something that has a lot more perspective to it, then I might be working at 25mm. So let's just take a look at two very different kinds of focal lengths. Let's just type in 25 to start. And notice as I type in this focal length, even if I go down to 15, it appears that the scene is moving farther away from us. Well, that's not the case. It's just that the focal length has changed, and that has an effect on the way that the camera and the scene relate to each other. The camera's position in space has actually remained exactly the same. So if I wanted to fill up the screen with about as much space as I had before, I would have to basically move the camera closer now. But look at that. That is a very, the depth between here, it looks like it's really, really far. Like these two are really far apart now. Now, if I were to play around with this, so let's say we go in the opposite direction. Let's say that we go to 100 mils. Now, I am actually, looks like I'm quite zoomed in on this. and I have to sort of pull back a bit, physically pull back. And if I line these up here, now these two objects feel like they're a lot closer together. And that's what I mean about a lower focal length having the effect of giving you more perspective in the scene, and a higher focal length giving you the sense of the scene is sort of crushing together. So depending on what it is that you want to achieve in your shot, you might want there to be a whole bunch of the background and the foreground kind of close together, or you might want to create a sense of a dynamic sense of depth with perspective, and therefore need a lower focal length. So those are just some things to get started. Now, what happens when we deal with the focal length is that also would naturally have an effect in the real world on our depth of field. But Maya and most 3D software disable things like depth of field by default because it's a more expensive calculation, and in the interest of having real-time playback, there's no sense in trying to cut down on that optimization. So if I go down to the depth of field settings here, I can enable depth of field. And let me just see here, if I come into Viewport 2.0, which is my advanced viewport renderer, this will give me a preview of what the depth of field actually will look like for my scene, which is kind of nice. It's a live preview. I'll turn off the grid, and I'm going to turn off the joints as well, because I don't need to see the joints in the scene. So show joints, and those go away. Also don't need to see that locator. Show locators, turn that off. And that's also an IK handle. So show IK handles, turn those off. Get rid of everything, basically. Okay, so what we need to figure out is what part of this shot should be in focus and what should be out of focus. Right now, nothing's in focus, so that's a bit of an issue. What I can do is just click back on my camera attributes here to get back into my settings. And what this is telling me over here is that there is a focus distance of 5, which means that 5 units in front of this camera is where the scene will be in focus. Okay, so what I could do is start typing in some additional values here, or I could even just play around with some of my interactive tools. What you can do is if you hold down the control key and middle mouse click and drag over your number and you keep sliding, you eventually start to interactively increase this value. You'll notice that eventually, if I get up to somewhere around 37.5 in my case, it starts to become in focus, okay, which is quite convenient. The f-stop is a measure of the aperture, and hopefully, as you recall from your lessons dealing with cameras, an f-stop of 5.6 is fairly open. The aperture is fairly open, and so a lot of light is coming into the scene. And what that also means, though, in turn, is that the depth of field is very shallow, and therefore only a part of the scene will be in focus, and the rest will be really blurry, which is what we're seeing in this case. If I decrease the f-stop, that is, if I were to make the f-stop larger, technically, I should say if I decrease the aperture but make the f-stop larger because it's an inverse relationship, what's going to happen is the perceived depth of field is going to become broader or wider. So if I were to take this value, and let's just say that we put it at something like 13, now more of the shot, although not much, more of the shot is actually in focus. Let's put it up to something much larger like 22. Okay, so it's not having any perceived effect on the overall brightness in the scene, but it is having a little bit of an effect on how much of the shot is in focus. Now, ultimately, this is only a preview here, and is not immensely perfect in any way. We won't really see what the depth of field is in our shot until we did some rendering, some proper rendering. So let's just put this back to 5.6 real quick. There is another thing I want to point out is if we want to figure out, without interactively adjusting our focus distance, how far away an object is from the camera, we can do that by coming up to our display, heads-up display, and have a look at our object details, I believe. Right, so if I click on the apple here, this will tell me now that the object's distance, its center, which is important to realize, its center point, distance from camera is 37.548. Okay, and if I came back here and I looked at what I had on my camera, I was at 36.8, so that was pretty close. If I were looking at the bowl in general, 37.932, and it's probably worthwhile pointing out that that is talking about the center point of the bowl right there is 37.932, and not the outer lip, which if we just do a render test here real quick, let's just for the sake of making it really clear, what I'm going to do is open this up here and let's do a default render and see what we get. Now, okay, that's kind of interesting. Look, I went to render this, but the issue is that as I rendered it, I ended up with not even the shot that I had expected, not the right camera. So right now it's set to camera perspective. If I come into my render settings and I scroll down here, I can change my renderable camera from the default perspective to shot cam in this case. So what happens now when I render? Will it work? Well, it's actually still rendering perspective. It kind of gets locked into whatever it did first. So if you want to override this, it's not too difficult. You just come up to the render menu here and choose render, render, shot cam. And this way it's going to render out the correct camera. All right, so it did it really quickly, and you might have noticed that at the very first it rendered out the shot completely without any depth of field, and it applied the depth of field a moment later. It did it really, really fast. You might have missed it. So right now the depth of field is quite noticeable, and if I were to look at this shot and again analyze the center point of the bowl, which is 37.932, and I were to put that value, 37.932, right there into my focus distance and re-render, okay, it's not doing too bad, but you can see that this outer lip is just ever so slightly blurred, right? If my goal, for instance, was to make sure that this point right here on the outer lip of that bowl was in focus and everything else was, kind of blurring away from that, what I would need to do is properly measure where that location is on that bowl. So probably the easiest way to do that would be to come in and create a locator object. So create locator, and I'm just going to move that over to where the edge of the bowl is, which is this point right here on the edge of the bowl, and I just have to move it up in my front view to match, more or less, somewhere around there. I think pull that down just a little bit. There we go. And what this is telling me now is that the value at that point on this little tiny dot in space, which is basically what a locator is, it's just a dot in space, is 36.331. So if I came back in here, selected my camera again, and typed in that value, 36.331, and save that image and re-render, now that lip is perfectly in focus and everything else is becoming out of focus, away from it. Okay, now let's just take this exact same example and let's go ahead and change our f-stop. Remember, we had changed this up to 13 before, but it didn't look like it had that much of a difference in our preview. However, we should probably notice a bit more of a difference in the actual render. Let's compare those two. So we're starting to see a bit more of the bowl farther away, right? And just for the sake of example, let's have a look at f22. Now you can really type in any value that you want here. You just have to kind of bear in mind that there are some lenses in the real world that are more realistic than others. And f22 may or may not be. I mean, that's kind of a normal f-stop range. If you get to f40, that's like a really highly expensive lens. So anything above that can be not so believable. But again, it's really only matters how much do you want it to look a particular way. So you don't have to limit yourself to the real world. I could set this to 60, for example, and to see what I get. All right, so that's just got a little bit of a blur out here and not any right here, basically. So there you go. Now, what's cool about this is you could render a sequence using the distance from camera as your guide for, let's say that you had what's called a rack focus, which is where you go from being where one thing's in focus and then you pull out to focus on another thing. Then I would start out by having a value of maybe, or I should say the focus distance here would start out at 36.331, which corresponds to where my lip of the bowl is here, and then later on I would find out what the location distance from camera is maybe for the lamp, right? And that's at a distance of 64.795. So all these values here are keyable. What you can do is just right click on it and say set key. And on any one key you can type in what you want as the value. And then between those keys, and of course it's going to interpolate between them. So if I wanted to go from that to over 50 frames to 64.795, right? I can see it here in the interactive renderer. That is just going to go between them. Actually, I think at the moment, if I look in probably my render settings, I'll put up my graph editor, window, settings, window, animation editors, graph editor, and I look at the camera, select the camera. The focus distance is the value that we were editing here, and you can see, oh, did I not? Oh, I know what happened. Ha ha ha. All right, silly Jason. 36.331 is where we started. I typed in a value over here of, what was it, 65 or 64, something like that. 65 is close enough. But I never set the key. I would explain why I did that wrong. So come back to our attributes and type in 65. And because I don't have currently auto keyframe on, I would need to right click on that and say set key. Otherwise it's not going to automatically set it. So if I look at this now and just scrub through here, you can see that focus is changing over time. All right, I'm going to turn that f-stop way down so it's even more observable. All right, there we go. So that's something that would render out as well if I were to get to that final frame there and had a look at it. Just have a render here. There we go. So that's more in focus. That's totally out of focus now. Now, of course, the thing to bear in mind is that if you were to compare your shot before and after, let's just say that we went back to our first shot there, which is currently rendering out at roughly 4 seconds, and I turned off depth of field altogether, it's going to have a dramatic impact on the render time. So that was 2 seconds without, and it was 4 seconds with. Sometimes it can be even more dramatic than that. So just something to bear in mind as you consider adding things like depth of field to your shots. But overall, it does produce a nice sense of more believability in the shot.